Thank you for being here. It's a weekday and it's the middle of the day, so to have people in the audience, it's no small thing. Thanks for being here. I'm going to assume that as many people in the audience have no clue about my work, and some of you do. Just to put the rest of the slides in context, my first work, Kari, which came out in 2008, was an extremely personal work about a queer protagonist in Mumbai, a place called Smog City. And it is basically about a young woman's relationships with the city, with glamorous roommates, with a world she doesn't exactly fit in, with a lover, with her sexuality, things like that, very close to home. So once the book was done, it was so close to home that I felt like I was without skin. And it was important for me to put a distance between myself and the work that I was creating, to not have first-person narratives that resembled me so much. And for multiple reasons, what I then fell into for 8 years was a duology based on the epics of India, on the Mahabharata, one of our big epics of the country, and Adi Parva, which came out in 2012, and Sauptik in 2016 conclude that duology based on the Mahabharata. I'm frequently asked about what it was about mythology that made me shift from the kind of themes I was working with before, which were feminine, which were contemporary, queer, possibly what people would classify as cool, which would not necessarily be what people would think of my content matter that followed. If I were to think of one single thing, the books are not based about forests and about exiles, but if there were one single thing about the mythology that drew me in, it was this very repeat motif that happened all the time. It's there in the Mahabharata a couple of times. It's there in the Ramayana. It's the idea of the protagonist needing to leave what was home, needing to leave their place as royals and move into the forest. These were not day trips or week trips. These were sizable amounts of time spent in the wilderness. So you had 7 years, 14 years, you know, the kind of time that a cricket spends underground transforming. What happened in these exiles were that kings suddenly became paupers. Householders were made out of people that lived in palaces, served by dozens upon dozens of minions. What happened also over there was that people were forced to come to terms with fears, with things that they had been arrogant about all their lives, with the dark side of things, and with basically it was the Academy of Hard Knocks, what happened once they walked into the forest. Jewelry was cast aside. They became essentially forest dwellers. Now, in a forest, what happens is that you realize that you are part of a much, much larger scheme of things. You shrink. You become something that is small, while the forces around you become larger, and you realize that it is really, really not all about you. The rules of the world that you have come from, the moral codes, this idea of justice, which keeps us intact and standing in complex societies, it becomes patently meaningless once you're in the forest. This idea was interesting to me. So what happens when characters at various points go into the forest? Basically, they realize that all the wisdom, all the things that they have gathered until then, it is dust. So they begin to learn skills. They begin to configure anew. They learn to eat things that will not kill them. They learn to bring down animals much larger than them in single combat. They learn that the machismo of heroes, in cities, you celebrate the hero that is fearful of nothing and that will go and take on things that are 50 times their size. In a forest, you learn humility. You realize what is the time to hibernate. You realize what is the time to retreat. And you realize when it is and how it is that you need to make your first move of attack. In all the forests that I met, there is a stirring of some sort. There is a coming of age kind of sexuality. You know, there's a shift that happens in the characters. There are love affairs with people who will never ever follow you back to the city. These are special to me. often in the tellings of the stories, people speed through these love affairs. But these are very, very significant because frequently this is the one time when these masculine and heroic figures are in relationship with equals, with females that ask, who will reach out and say, "Sexy man, be mine." So essentially, in the kind of royalty and in the kind of very masculine setup that exists, the forests are where some of the most, in my opinion, some of the most tender and equal love affairs unfold. And basically, everyone knows that these are too fragile to be pulled out of this ecosystem and taken anywhere. So there is that kind of a doomed love affair feeling about them. So whether it is Bhim or Hidimba, these are stories. Well, Arjun also meets Ulupi, he meets Chitrangada. Yeah. What is it that rishis really do in a forest? People have this notion that they're sitting and contemplating about non-duality, or I don't even know what, physics. I'm not sure. But one of the most important things that a rishi does in a forest is watch. Anyone that has done even beginner-level meditation knows that to sit still and watch is perhaps harder than to learn how to mount a wild horse or whatever it is that heroic creatures do. So there is this business of watching. There is this business of watching that is so intensive that an anthill grows around you. You have become so still that basically things are growing on you, atop you. You are part of things. And as you start to understand things, this idea of watching and doing this penance, it's called tapasya. And unfortunately, one of the byproducts, a guaranteed byproduct of tapasya, is the growth of phenomenal amounts of arrogance in the person that begins to gather this wisdom. Large amounts, heaty stuff, lust, anger. I will burn you to ashes. These are the kind of threats that somebody that has accumulated large amounts of tapasya routinely comes up with. And what happens typically, another motif that recurs in stories of the forest, is that when you start becoming this creature who is getting top-heavy and becoming a risk to himself, you have a being that emerges from the waters. It's an apsara, etymologically a creature that appears out of water. There is an apsara deployed to basically be a fire extinguisher to all the heat that you've been building up. You are put out, null and void. And it is significant that this is a creature that emerges out of waters because every time mythology talks about something, it is also not talking about that thing. So when you're talking about a locust, it is actually a metaphor for a human. When you're talking about a monkey, it could also mean something else. So when you're talking about apsara, I mean, she's not a bimbo. She's not a bimbo seductress sent out who has nothing else to do. She is a missile. She will decimate. It is a very purposeful sort of plot device. And there are, of course, these elements which are very necessarily connected with the telling of the story. The stories in the forest are continuously about reminding you about your forgotten connection with elements of nature. Forests are also places where you move with an altered convoy. You move with one spouse, but not necessarily the other. The children are often left behind with somebody else. This friend comes, that friend doesn't. Some followers and acolytes turn up, the rest peel away. It is a moment of reckoning. You realize who you stand with and who stands with you. It is a moment where you know who your people are. And often, the stories often revolve with people creating the truest allies and truest alliances once they're in a forest. Now, much as I wanted to not be intimate, it is always you're talking about in your work if you're a certain kind of a person. So when monkeys are referring to humans and something else is referring to something else, everything that Amruta was doing was also a personal battlefield being addressed via the work. That is just the nature of what I do. So essentially, one of the things that personally was very, very important to me about the telling of the epics, why the epics, is because in my reading of them, the way I understood them, one thing that set them really, really apart from a lot of stories from other parts of the world is that they continuously refused to be didactic. They did not, in my readings of them, tell me this is right and this is wrong. Walk this way and you shall be fine. Walk this way and you are needing to look after yourself. Every single choice was ambiguous. Everything that happened made you feel mixed feelings. There were situations where somebody that you were rooting for all along in that story did something so despicable that somebody is going to say, how could your hero have done this? And you are never meant to have a clean-cut answer to that. The epics taught me that decisions are often ambiguous, and this ambiguity is very precious because it always makes you realize that there is margin for error, that I may be wrong, and that this may not entirely be as I see it. To give one example, this image is from a sequence, a terrifying sequence in the Mahabharata, which is there in my book Sauptik, which is called the Khandav Dahan, which essentially was the burning of a primeval forest so that an empire could be raised in its stead. What a terrifying thing that was, that inferno. They burnt every single thing. They burnt baby birds. They burnt snakes. They burnt tribe people that were living within the forest. Very, very few things escaped. And this burning was not some regular burning. The people orchestrating it was one of Mahabharata's alpha heroes, who simplistic readers will say that was one of the heroes of the goodies, the good side. He was Arjun, the Pandav. And the other side, the person helping him, was the avatar Krishna himself. The avatar of Vishnu, Krishna, who is one of the characters of the Mahabharata. Such a terrible fire, and you are always needing to deal with the discomfort that this thing came to pass. How did this thing come to pass? What am I supposed to feel? And you realize one thing, that regardless of what is good, what is bad, what are the details of the story, the net result is that if empire is to set its roots in a ground, a forest has to burn. You cannot have both things. And that you will always be making a choice that is brutal to somebody or the other. Now, this is the external kind of ambiguity. The ambiguity was also on moral grounds. There's plenty of it in the forests, lot of it. So, for example, this is an episode where these gopis, or these women who tend cows by day, these are not young damsels, single, ready to mingle at all. The gopis, as they appear in the epics, are very much women with husbands and children and mothers-in-law and like entire households running under their watch. Now, what happens over here? Something happens, something stirs. And these women, who had until then been the ideal women in the home, decide that I have to go and I have to fuse with my lover. And when they have that stirring inside them, they leave everything behind and they go. They do not fear breaking convention because they know that is what they need to do. So they will leave a sleeping husband in the bed. They will leave behind some food burning on the stove. Their hair is unkempt. Their clothes may not all be right, but they leave when they must. This is not to me a prescription for simplistic goody-goody morals. Nothing in the epics is in my reading of it. Another thing is that this business of going into forests is not like a one-size-fit-all affair. So in Sauptik, for example, there is one particular forest exile when 5 brothers and their common wife walk into a forest. In my understanding of it, it was not one forest that they walked into, but 5 + 1 forests that they walked into. Because what each person was dealing with, the thing that each person had to contend with, was their internal tangles. Each person dealt with what they needed to, and their experience was very, very solitary, although they walked in together into what appeared to be one forest. So these were the most content of the lot. These were the least angsty of those heroes. There were these twins, Nakul and Sahadev, and their forest was least complicated because they were the least roiling inside of them. This was the forest that belonged to the one who would be king. It was the forest of the man who's cursed to be king. Because the fact is that when you belong to everybody, when you belong to all the citizens of the land, you cannot really do justice to your wife. And we see that unfolding. And it's not fun, and it's not justifiable, but it is a fact that you cannot belong to the multitudes and to one individual at the same time. There is the forest of the mighty Bhim. And the mighty Bhim, another hero, when he goes, he's swaggering and he's deeply arrogant about his mightiness. What is it that he does in this forest? He treats the wife that travels with them like a jewel. His tender side emerges. He collects lotuses for her. He does things that most swaggering macho men do not do in cities. That is the beauty of his forest. And he also learns how to deal with his own arrogance there. Another person's forest is basically about being way ahead in his learning curve than all the rest that he's traveling with. So he needs to break away. He needs to be a solo player when he goes. And when he goes, it is a whirl of love affairs. It is a whirl of people that have to be left behind, hearts that need to be broken, ammunition that needs to be collected. That is his forest. And this is the forest of a really, really precious and beautiful character in the book called Draupadi, who is the queen of cursed fate in some ways, the person who doesn't get her due, the person who's married to 5 but feels alone, the one who is certainly not a weak person and who needs to stand up for herself in a crowded room of alpha men and tell them what they are, which is not very much, and she disdains them and their knees shall be broken. So in her forest, what happens to her? In her forest, her rage is calmed. In her forest, she moves around and she recognizes that she has to bury this ember, that she will burn when she leaves, if she goes with that. So all of this has been about roiling and boiling and burning and churning and things like that. But one of the things that happens when you have been training really, really hard to play something at competitive level is that one day you learn how to play. You learn how to play, and suddenly it is not all about sweating and burning and calluses, but also about much more gentle things, which also happen in the forest. Because the reality is that an urban person, to be in a forest is actually not just the punishment that it would appear to be from a distance. It is also quiet time. It is time when you are actually getting to be alone with those you want to be alone with. It is a place where you learn to make friends with the elements of nature, you learn to dance. Which is why in the Indian mythology, a lot of the most amorous scenes with Krishna happen in the deepest of groves, happen in places surrounded by trees. And in some ways, it is teaching you on an internal level to inhabit your body in a full way. And in a way that is not just about strutting and flexing your muscles, but in a gentle way of grace and beauty. And that also happens in the forest. You come to your adult body mass. You come to being adults, and then you return to the city. Because the idea of return is very much built into the idea of exile, as we will see later. In this particular episode, the same Draupadi, who has that burning ember inside her body all her living life, she finally is resting. She's a woman inhabiting her moment. She's a woman at one with the elements, possibly for a brief amount of time, because they are going to come out and it is going to be bloodbath, and everybody knows it. But for this moment, she is like Gajalakshmi. She's being bathed by 4 elephants. She's loving it. She's owning the moment. She's not a lamb tied to a post. This is important, to inhabit the body with gentleness and beauty. Extensions of inhabiting the body. The forest is always, there is so much sexual overtone in the forest space. So this over here is somebody like a Kuber or somebody like a Yakshi, forest spirits, protectors of the earth. You know, like the dwarfs in Western mythology who are squat, close to the ground. Center of gravity keeps them close to where the treasures are buried. So this is a character like that. And he's comfortable, mustachioed and pot-bellied and naked and very much in his element over there. A Yakshi, voluptuous, large, and the largeness just grows and grows in my new work. I don't have slides of that, but I will possibly speak about it if the bell doesn't ring on me. Forest creature Hidimba, also in the forest. An equal love affair, if there ever was one. More of the same. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes, excellent. So in my new work, basically, if forest was a backdrop in Adiparva and Sauptik, my next work, which is called Aranyaka, the forest is the very universe itself, because Aranyaka means of the forest. And in this place, something different happens. The protagonists are not dueling to survive in this great wilderness. It is not me versus something immense and large. It is not me versus the predator who will eat me. It's not predator and prey and mortal combat. In this particular work, the forest that you inhabit is about you trying to understand your place in the larger schema. It's about you learning this way species look at each other. It is about taxonomy. It's about people learning to see each other in an interconnected way as ecosystems ought to be. Your barriers begin to dissipate when that happens. The anthropocentric? My long-lost stutters come back when this word is in my mouth. So when the anthropocentric things begin to dissolve, your borders dissolve, you expand, you become porous, and that is what happens to the heroine of my book, who's this immense woman who just goes larger and larger because her appetite is large for life itself. So this was about the forest, and the thing about forests is that you have to return, but when you return, and anybody who has been on exiles, self-imposed or otherwise, knows the city is not the same when you return, and you are not the same when you return. And the beauty is, and I think I'll paraphrase something that I read in reading Lolita in Tehran. The beauty of it is that you never quite understand what an exile is until you have come back to the land that you had left. So this is about forests and transformation. Thank you very much for your time.